This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market. On October 17th, 1916, a mighty ship was commissioned into the United States Navy. She was one of the most powerful warships of her time, bristling with weapons, and she would distinguish herself again and again in competitions among her peers. And yet her mighty 14-inch guns were never fired in anger, and she only participated briefly in a single battle. The USS Arizona is one of the most famous names in the history of the United States Navy, but perhaps for all the wrong reasons. She was a ship of war that became a symbol of war, but she perhaps most of all represented the peacetime Navy. This is your monthly reminder that the data pirates are still out there. They're collecting, aggregating, and selling your personal information to whatever scallywag comes along, and that can put you at real risk. It might mean that a scammer is able to craft a clever phishing email, or that a stalker is able to find your personal address, or that a thief is able to apply for a credit card or even commit crimes in your name. The good news is that you have the right to request data brokers to delete what information they have about you and to protect your privacy. The bad news is it would take you years to do it manually. Incogni can do the messy work for you automatically. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting your personal data removal, and dealing with their objections. And I can go anytime on my handy dashboard and see how Incogni continues to protect me. All the time. And now they have new ways to do it, with unlimited friends and family plans and a great new custom removal tool where you can point to any People Search site or any other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you. So fight the data pirates. Use the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/TheHistoryGuy to get an exclusive offer of 60% off. That's the code HistoryGuy at incogni.com/TheHistoryGuy, an exclusive offer of 60% off. Arrgh! USS Arizona was the second of two battleships of the Pennsylvania class, originally suggested by the Naval Board in 1911. It was an era of battleships. In an era when naval aviation was in its infancy and submarines still a novelty, the prevailing naval doctrine was that battleships represented the greatest ability to project power. A battleship was not just a weapon, but a symbol of strength. Design progressed rapidly in the early 20th century, sparking a naval arms race among the great powers that some argue was a primary driver of the Great War. The U.S. vision in this period was to modernize the fleet with a group of battleships of a standard-type design. That term generally meant ships would be built with similar performance capabilities in terms of speed and maneuverability, allowing them to operate together in a battle line. It did not, however, mean a single design. The classes of the standard type each represented incremental improvements, while maintaining certain standard capabilities. While there was a priority, especially from the Naval Board, for a rapid fleet modernization, Congress was stingy with the fleet, and authorization was limited to 1 or 2 ships per year. Thus, new battleships were rare. Each tended to be grander than those that came before, and each one represented both a symbol of pride and an argument by the Navy that it deserved greater priority. Thus, when the keel for USS Arizona was laid in March of 1914, the New York Times felt it important to note that the ship, along with its sister, the Pennsylvania, was the biggest fighting vessel built or building in any Navy. The Times noted that the first keel plate was hammered into place by the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, while the Navy Yard Band played the Star-Spangled Banner. The beginning of construction had actually been delayed a day in order to have Roosevelt attend. And that small fact, that Franklin Roosevelt had driven the first plate of the ship soon to be named Arizona, adds some context to events that would come nearly 3 decades later. But in 1914, the Navy had reason to tout the new battleship. The Times bragged, "There was none in the throng who did not realize that the banging of the hammer meant the actual construction of the biggest ship ever built in New York, and with the sole exception of the Pennsylvania, now in course of construction at Newport News, the largest ever constructed in this hemisphere." It was certainly a step for the Navy. The Times wrote in 1913, before construction began, that the new ship would be 31,400 tons, which means that it would be a vessel twice as big as the famous old around-the-world flagship Connecticut, more than 11,000 tons greater than the dreadnoughts Delaware and North Dakota, and almost 6,000 tons bigger than the mighty Wyoming, the new flagship of the Atlantic Fleet. The ship was, still at the time, only called Battleship 39, but the Times noted that the new super dreadnought would carry 12 14-inch guns and require the efforts of 1,000 skilled mechanics to construct it for an estimated cost of $16 million. By June, Secretary of the Navy Daniels decided that the ship would be named after the state that had been most recently admitted to the Union, Arizona. On June 13, 1915, the Times estimated that 50,000 people would be on hand to watch the great ship launch, noting again the claim that with Pennsylvania, the ship would be the world's biggest commissioned battleship. Just a week later, the paper reported that the crowd was itself half again larger than expected. Everybody in that mighty crowd, the Times wrote, grew prouder from the moment that Miss Esther Ross, the sponsor, smashed the two beribboned bottles against the Arizona's bow. The two bottles themselves were signs of the times. Arizona had been at the forefront of the national prohibition movement, first banning the manufacture and consumption of alcohol in the state on a ballot measure in November of 1914. While the tradition of using a bottle of champagne to christen the ship was maintained, a second bottle filled with water from a lake in Arizona was also used. A concession, Sean McKinnon of the newspaper AZ Central explains, the big city reporters confided to prohibitionists back in Arizona. McKinnon writes that Miss Ross, the daughter of a Prescott, Arizona pharmacist, had practiced her duties every day after school, smashing syrup bottles full of water against a fence behind the house. Now she stood on a platform, the great ship towering over her, the Williamsburg Bridge stretched across the river in one direction, and the 60-story Woolworth Building, the tallest skyscraper in the world, in the other. She wore a white hat with a white plume and clutched a bouquet of flowers, jostled at times by her maids of honor, her mother, the governor, and the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. The process of launching a ship this size was complex and had been meticulously planned, so much so that the engineering of the launch was the subject of an article in a 1915 edition of International Marine Engineering, noting important details like the sliding ways and cradle were 70 inches wide, and the initial pressure per square foot on the grease was about 2.27 tons, which was, the magazine assured readers, well within the maximum allowable for the yard building slip. The process was well managed, with the article's author, G.H. Barker, noting that the vessel was afloat in about 42 seconds. The Times wrote, the picture was one never to be forgotten. There were people everywhere. Half a dozen Marine bands from the Navy Yard and the ships of the Atlantic Fleet stood at attention, ready to start the Star-Spangled Banner when the Arizona began to move. Bishop Atwood of the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona uttered a short prayer. On shore, the thousands cheered and cheered and cheered. The music of the bands all playing the national anthem was doomed in the noise. Every siren in the yard bellowed its loudest. Secretary Daniels gave a speech after, in which he called the new ship the Queen of the Seas. The purpose for which she exists is the protection of the American home. The Arizona is the latest addition to a fleet whose purpose is to be the right arm of American defense, or to be attacked by a foreign foe. The speech was clearly intended to justify the enormous expenditures on a peacetime navy and express its purpose to what was largely at the time an isolationist nation, that the goal was to prevent war rather than to wage it. Then he said something that might seem chilling to those of us who know what the future held. It is a consummation devoutly to be wished that the Arizona may never be attacked. But if she is, we believe she will give a good account of herself. After 16 months of fitting out, another ceremony was held as she was commissioned into the Navy. The Times wrote, the Super Dreadnought Arizona, latest addition to the United States Navy and the largest and most powerfully armed fighting ship ever built at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, went in commission at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, while the blue jackets from a half a dozen other dreadnoughts, the yard staff, and a large number of civilians looked on. The ceremony, however, was hiding a problem. The Mount Vernon, Ohio Democratic Banner wrote, this addition to the Navy is far from a clear gain in strength, however, since it was necessary to strip 3 other battleships of their crews and place them in reserve to find a full complement of men for the new fighter. While the Times writes, do you realize, said an officer of the Arizona yesterday, that this one ship has more big guns than the Kansas, Vermont, and New Hampshire combined, and that a broadside from the Arizona's 14-inch guns weighs 6,600 pounds more than would be a broadside of all the 12-inch guns of those 3 ships? Still, there was a problem. President Wilson had signed the Naval Expansion Act of 1916 in August, dramatically increasing the size of the fleet and expanding the enlisted strength of the Navy to 87,000 men. The act was largely driven by concerns given the war in Europe, but the same war had made recruiting difficult. The war had produced an economic boom in the United States as factories hummed with goods to be exported to Europe. Unemployment was low, and men difficult to recruit. Growing a peacetime navy with war abroad was a difficult task. The new ship would have to do more than be a strong arm. It would have to convince a skeptical public and Congress that a navy was worth the time and expense. The U.S. and its navy would enter the war the following April. But the Arizona, billed as one of the most powerful warships in the world, would not go overseas to join the Grand Fleet. Oddly, the great ship commissioned just in time for war was too new. The Naval History and Heritage Command explains the Royal Navy was initially not interested in having U.S. battleships sent to Europe. That changed, however, when the need to man newly built light cruisers and destroyers needed for anti-submarine operations created a shortage of trained sailors. To meet this demand, the Admiralty chose to decommission some of the older battleships in the Grand Fleet and transfer their sailors to meet the shortfall. In the interest of maintaining its numerical superiority over the German High Sea Fleet, the Admiralty, in September 1917, requested that the U.S. Navy send a contingent of battleships to reinforce the Grand Fleet. But there was a catch. The newer battleships, including Pennsylvania and Arizona, were oil-fired, but older ships like USS Texas and New York were coal-fired. The History and Heritage Command writes, given the abundance of high-quality coal in the British Isles and the scarcity of oilers to support the fleet, the British requested that the Navy dispatch battleships fueled with coal. The world was at war, and one of the most powerful ships of war, the Naval History and Heritage Command writes, operated out of Norfolk, Virginia, serving as a gunnery training ship. It was a small thing, as the Grand Fleet never saw the second Jutland that had been envisioned, but Arizona would miss its first war. Her contribution came after the end, when the History and Heritage Command writes, a week after armistice was reached on 11 November 1918, Arizona steamed to Portland, England, to rendezvous with transport George Washington, who was carrying President Woodrow Wilson to meet with European leaders. Arizona, one of the newest and most powerful American dreadnoughts, served as part of the honor escort to transport the president to Brest, France. After she embarked 238 homeward-bound veterans of the Great War, Arizona set sail from Brest and arrived off Ambrose Light on the afternoon of Christmas Day, 1918. The next day she passed in review before Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, who was in the yacht Mayflower off the Statue of Liberty, before entering New York Harbor in a great homecoming celebration. Once again, the world was at peace, and once again the Navy would struggle to justify itself. But that didn't mean that Arizona sat still. Quite the contrary. In 1925, the Arizona Republic quoted sailor M.L. Powers, who served in 1918 and 1919. During the time I was on the Arizona, from November 1918 to July 1919, we traveled 29,447 miles and visited England, France, New York, Cuba, Spain, Turkey, Panama, and the Barbados. We met President Wilson 1,000 miles off of Brest when he went to France and escorted him into Brest. The Arizona was the first American battleship through the Dardanelles after the armistice was signed. She was at Smyrna, Turkey, when the Greeks took the city in 1919. In that time, the ship developed the reputation that she would hold throughout her career, epitomized by her unofficial motto, ATOM, a contraction of At Them, Arizona. Powers bragged, we held the Battenberg Cup, given by Lord Battenberg of England, to the best racing ship in any navy for skill at racing. We won it from the USS Nevada, which had held it for 6 years. We won 11 E's for efficiency in firing, one of the best records in the Navy. Powers, whom the newspaper refers to as an ex-gob, slang word for an enlisted sailor, opined, I tell you, if your state of Arizona is half as good as the ship named for your state, I'm going to make my home here. She may not have fired her guns in war, but Arizona was making its mark in peacetime. Recruiting advertisements were labeled, if you'd been on the Arizona, noting her crew boasts that no millionaire tourist ever globetrotted like this. There was one period in 4 weeks in which the crew saw the coasts of North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. You can enlist for 2 years and come out broader, stronger, abler, the recruiting poster said. The Navy made a man of me, is the expression often heard. In August of 1921, Arizona transited the Panama Canal. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes, for the next nearly 2 decades, Arizona served as flagship for battleship divisions 2, 3, or 4, homeported at San Pedro, California. In 1925, Arizona was part of the fleet visit to Australia, the subject of another episode of the History Guy. In 1924, there was an odd scandal. The Arizona had transited the canal for fleet maneuvers in the Caribbean, and on the way back, a pretty girl stowaway was discovered in sailor's garb. The LA Times wrote that Madeline Blair, who gave a New Jersey address, was discovered not by the ship's officers, but by a New York City policeman named Charles Camonto, who happened to have been visiting the ship while on a vacation in California. He had gone to call on a friend in the crew and was watching a squad of sailors at work on deck. A riffle of wind swept the deck and lifted the cap from the head of one of the men, disclosing a crown of telltale hair. "Say, look," Camonto exclaimed to his friend, pointing to the sailor. "That's not a bluejacket. That's a girl." The paper writes she had eluded the eyes of every officer for 5 weeks. Miss Blair was apparently trying to make her way to Hollywood. 9 sailors were implicated in smuggling her aboard, and eventually 23 total faced courts-martial for helping to hide her. In July of 1929, the ship, which had been at sea for 13 years, underwent, the Naval History and Heritage Command writes, a 20-month modernization that included tripod masts surmounted by 3-tiered fire control tops, replacing the old cage masts, and 5-inch 25-caliber anti-aircraft guns replaced the 3-inch 50-caliber weapons with which she had been equipped. She also received additional armor to help protect her from torpedo or near-miss damage from bombs, and she received new boilers as well as new main and cruising turbines. She was such a model for the fleet that in full cooperation with the U.S. Navy, the Arizona was used in a portion of the filming of the James Cagney romantic comedy, Here Comes the Navy. The website of Turner Classic Movie writes, drenched in Navy atmosphere, it was filmed in real Navy locations and populated with real Navy extras polishing guns and swabbing decks in the background. Most impressive of all, much of the action was shot on the USS Arizona. She was a venerable ship, but a proud one. The Tucson Citizen reported, "Atom Arizona is a famous slogan in the U.S. battle fleet, a phrase that has come to mean the fighting spirit of a great ship. In gunnery, Navy sports, and fleet tactics, the USS Arizona, by virtue of this enthusiasm which has stuck with her ship's company since the World War, has remained at the top in fleet competitions, despite the handicap of larger, faster, electrically driven, heavier-gunned dreadnoughts with which she has to keep pace." In May of 1940, the Pacific Fleet base was moved from San Pedro to Pearl Harbor, a move intended to deter Japanese aggression in the Pacific. On December 4th, 1941, she conducted a night fire exercise along with USS Nevada and Oklahoma, and on December 5th, her band advanced to the semifinals of a fleet music competition. The finals were scheduled for December 20th. On December 7th, Arizona was moored next to Ford Island at berth F7, next to the repair ship USS Vestal. Secretary Daniels' devout wish that the USS Arizona would never be attacked met its end that day. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began at 7:55 a.m., and just 15 minutes later, an armor-piercing bomb penetrated Arizona's deck into her forward powder magazine. The resulting explosion killed 1,177 of the 1,512 crewmen on board at the time. Nearly half of the men killed in the attack that day were of her crew. Did the ship, as Daniels hoped, give a good account of herself? It depends how that is measured. But the Naval History and Heritage Command writes, acts of heroism were abundant on that day on board Arizona. 3 medals of honor were awarded to her crew that day. You have to imagine that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he gave his famous speech on December 8, 1941, was recalling that it was he himself who had thrown the first hammer blow that began the construction of the great ship that had been destroyed the day before. That had to be running through his mind when he said to the United States Congress, "We will win inevitable victory. So help us God." Atom Arizona was replaced by Remember the Arizona. Her name would rise to become among the most famous in the 250-year history of the United States Navy. 2 million people still visit the USS Arizona every year. But there was more to that ship than those terrible 15 minutes. Atom Arizona. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.